In the middle of the world's most unforgiving deserts, where sunlight doesn't just fall but seems to press down like weight, there are places where stone structures rise in unexpected precision, as if the landscape itself had once been measured, divided, and carefully organized by something more deliberate than survival. In southern Arabia, in parts of the Sahara's ancient trade corridors, and across forgotten stretches of the Middle East, researchers have occasionally documented what appear to be abandoned settlements aligned in ways that do not immediately match simple explanations of shelter, defense, or even trade convenience. Walls run parallel for kilometers where no modern road exists. Channels cut through dry earth in directions that seem to ignore terrain logic, and in some cases, entire clusters of ruins appear positioned around depressions in the land that today hold nothing but dust and wind. At first glance, these are simply the remnants of early human adaptation, another example of how people once learned to survive in harsh environments. This is the standard explanation, and in many ways it is a reasonable one. Ancient communities did, of course, build around water. They did follow seasonal flows, and they did engineer irrigation systems that allowed life to persist in places that would otherwise seem impossible. But when you begin to look at certain regions collectively, rather than in isolation, a subtle question begins to form, not as a conclusion, but as an observation that resists easy dismissal. Why do so many of these desert settlements appear arranged as if they were part of a larger system, rather than independent villages responding separately to local conditions? In archaeology, the conventional answer is usually rooted in coincidence, environmental constraints, and gradual development over time. Settlements expand outward from water sources, trade routes evolve naturally, and infrastructure emerges incrementally over generations. This model is supported by abundant evidence across most of human history, and it remains the foundation of how ancient development is understood. Yet there are cases where the pattern feels unusually coordinated. In the ancient fringes of the Sahara, for instance, satellite imaging has revealed networks of dry riverbeds that intersect with ruins positioned at regular intervals. Some of these structures appear to sit at junction points where underground water once converged, suggesting not only awareness of water sources, but an ability to anticipate and organize around a shifting hydrological system. Official interpretations describe these as practical settlements, carefully placed for survival, which is entirely plausible. Ancient societies were observant, and they often understood their environment in ways that modern assumptions sometimes underestimate. Still, what draws attention is not a single site, but repetition across wide distances, as if multiple communities were responding to a shared design principle without leaving explicit records of coordination. In parts of ancient Mesopotamia, for example, early irrigation systems are well documented. Canals diverted river water into agricultural fields, supporting some of the earliest known urban civilizations. These systems are often described as linear progressions of engineering, simple beginnings that gradually became more complex over centuries. But in some excavated regions, particularly near abandoned city layers buried beneath later settlements, researchers have identified canal remnants that appear to extend beyond what would have been necessary for local agriculture. In certain cases, these channels seem to connect distant zones that were not obviously part of a single political entity at the time they were constructed. The conventional explanation is that political boundaries were fluid, and that what appears disconnected today may have once been unified under forgotten administrations. That remains a strong possibility. History is full of lost kingdoms and undocumented periods of central control. Still, there are moments where the scale of coordination feels almost infrastructural in a way that resembles something more systemic than political. Not a single city managing water, but a landscape subtly shaped as if multiple settlements were part of a broader environmental logic. As we move further into the Arabian Peninsula, similar patterns emerge. Ancient inscriptions and archaeological surveys have documented settlements near now dry wadis, many of which show signs of repeated reoccupation across centuries. These were not static cities, but living systems that rose and fell with water availability. This alone is not unusual. Human civilization has always been tied to water cycles. What becomes more intriguing is the consistency in how these sites appear to be positioned along natural drainage lines that no longer function today. In some cases, the erosion patterns suggest that these waterways once carried seasonal floods with a level of predictability that would have allowed for sophisticated planning. In others, the sheer density of settlements along a single basin raises questions about whether water was simply followed or actively managed at a scale that is difficult to reconstruct fully from the remaining evidence. Hydrology experts generally caution against overinterpretation. Desert landscapes change dramatically over millennia, and what appears structured today may simply be the result of long-term erosion processes. Ancient peoples, they argue, were highly adaptive rather than systematically coordinated across vast regions. And yet, there is a recurring tension in the data. Adaptation on such a large scale often begins to resemble design when viewed from a distance. Further west, in the remains of North African trade networks, similar questions arise. Caravans once crossed enormous distances, linking coastal cities with inland settlements. Along these routes, ruins appear at intervals that correspond not only to travel distances, but also to subterranean water access points. Wells, cisterns, and underground aquifers often lie beneath these abandoned hubs, suggesting a relationship between human movement and hidden water infrastructure that may not have been fully accidental. Official narrative frames this as practical survival. Of course, travelers would settle near water. Of course, trade routes would evolve around necessity, and this explanation is consistent with observable human behavior. But what remains less explored is whether these systems were simply responsive or whether they preserved knowledge of water systems that were once more abundant or even deliberately managed on a scale that has not survived in written records. Across multiple regions, a pattern emerges not in the form of dramatic evidence, but in alignment, repetition, and placement. None of these elements alone suggest anything beyond advanced adaptation. Together, however, they form a kind of spatial memory embedded into the landscape, one that hints at a deeper relationship between human settlement and environmental control than is often assumed. Some researchers cautiously suggest that ancient desert cultures may have possessed a more integrated understanding of water cycles, one that included not just rivers and rainfall, but subterranean flows that shifted over centuries. In such a framework, what appears today as scattered ruins might once have functioned as nodes in a broader ecological system, designed not merely for survival, but for long-term stabilization of scarce water resources. If that interpretation holds any partial truth, then the collapse of these systems becomes just as important as their existence. Because across many of these regions, archaeological layers show repeated cycles of habitation and abandonment, often corresponding to periods of climatic change. Droughts, shifting monsoon patterns, and long-term desertification events are well documented in paleoclimate studies. Civilizations did not simply vanish, they often withdrew as environmental conditions changed beyond the limits of their infrastructure. Yet there remains an open question about whether some of these systems failed gradually through environmental stress alone, or whether the loss of coordinated knowledge played a role in accelerating decline. In other words, if a region once functioned like a connected system, where water was distributed, managed, or anticipated across distances, what happens when that system becomes fragmented, its knowledge dispersed, its maintenance no longer continuous? Some climate historians have cautiously explored whether ancient environmental collapses can offer insight into modern vulnerability, not as direct parallels, but as reminders that large-scale systems, whether ecological, agricultural, or infrastructural, depend heavily on continuity of knowledge as much as on physical resources. And this is where the discussion quietly shifts from archaeology into something more reflective. Because the desert doesn't only preserve ruins, it preserves absences. It preserves the outlines of what once functioned, now reduced to traces that require interpretation rather than certainty. The idea that some ancient desert cities may have been part of broader water management systems remains unproven, and perhaps in many cases unnecessary to explain their existence.